held a guy at gunpoint, robbed him, very quickly apprehended, not much of a plan, and was sentenced to the state penitentiary here in Colorado for 10 years. That was in 1987. Went down to the state penitentiary for about 4.5 years, and they paroled me at 27 years old. So I walk out of the penitentiary, still a ninth grade high school dropout, still a punk and a knucklehead, and no skills, no trade, no education. Now I'm a convicted felon to boot, and I began the process, which turned out to be very, very destructive, of defining myself now as this loser convict, right? That's who I was. And so I made it about 18 months, went back to prison a second time for 2 years on parole violations and gun charges, got out again at 30 years old. Now I'm a 2-time convicted felon, no experience, no education, no skills, no trade, no nothing, and fell into a group of guys doing some shady telemarketing out in Las Vegas. I tell people I should have been suspicious when they hired me.
Entrepreneurship, got that inspiration. Yeah, now I'm just doing it. Working on these projects, my ideas I'm pursuing. No matter what the problem, the solution, I'm proving it. Let's talk about it and open up the dialogue. Contractors telling their stories about how they got it started and how they keep it going. The passion fuels the mission. Now we blasted into orbit, we gone. That's where we grow from. Started with the vision, make the pitch and knock it out the park like home runs. We keep it moving, self-belief, no doubt. Pass off the mic to my man's Jim Klauck.
Jim Klauck here on Contractor Stories. Weldon, welcome to the program.
Very glad to be here. Nice to see you, and thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're going to get into your story. Start off with what you're doing today, what you have been doing for, let's say, the past few years. And then we get to go back in time. We go in the time machine and we go back to when Weldon was young, and then we're going to bring it all the way back again to how you got to where you are today. Are you ready for this trip?
I'm ready to roll.
All right. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing, let's say, for the past 5 years?
Yeah, the last 5 years or so, and really going back 15, I've been teaching and speaking. I've written 3 books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Power of Consistency, another book called Consistency Selling. And I've been traveling, speaking, teaching contractors and others in other industries as well. Initially kind of started in the contracting world, which we'll kind of back into, I think, at some point in this conversation. As my books gained popularity, branched off in a lot of different industries, but really focusing on speaking, training, consulting with various businesses around the country, and a lot in I tell people everything I know about making money, I made in the contracting world. It's really where I kind of cut my teeth. But that's what I've been doing really the last 15 years. The last 5 years, a lot less travel thanks to COVID, which has been kind of nice, kind of redesigned our business, do a lot of stuff virtually now, which actually turned out to be real good for me because I used to travel 200,000 miles a year, and I got kind of tired of that. So that's what I've been doing in recent years.
A frequent flyer. I understand you work closely with Bob Mueller.
Yeah, so I actually own a contracting company, HVAC electrical company out here in Colorado. I've had about a half a dozen of those companies over the last 20 years. And the last 6 months or so, Bob invited me out to help him build his company and came in as an equity partner in that company as well out in Southern California. So keep my hands on the contracting side of the business just because there's so many good opportunities. You know, I always say this industry is not glamorous, it's not sexy, but there's an awful lot of money and an awful lot of opportunity in the industry.
Weldon, you're right. When I tell people that I spend a lot of time with contractors, with home service people, and these people from like the white collar world, they don't quite understand. The money's in the blue collar contracting business. It's not in other places. So most small business owners do not generate the income and the wealth that a small business operator or a medium or large business operator in home service can build and develop. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. Really unlimited potential. I've earned millions of dollars on the contracting side and on the training, consulting, and speaking side. But the reason that I've always kept a foot in the contracting world is because of the opportunity. We started this little company out here in Colorado just 4 years ago, and it'll do about 12 million this year. We're just getting involved with Bob's company out there, but we expect to scale that very quickly in the next 3 to 5 years and really build something special out there.
Yeah, that's exciting. That is exciting news. All right, let's go back in time a little bit, and we're going to work our way back. So when you were young, 10, 12 years old, who was Weldon Long?
You know, it's funny. I was the youngest of 5 kids, so I was the goofy kid, always trying to be funny to get attention when you're fighting for attention, being the youngest of 5 kids. My dad was career military, So we moved around a lot. Back in those days, you move almost every year. And so I look back on, I'm almost 60 now here in a couple of months. I look back on my young self. And what I really see is a really insecure, disconnected kid. All the moving was really hard because you were the new kid in school every year. Although that turned out to be a blessing and an asset as well, because I think it's where I got my public speaking skills, just learning to fit in, as you have to, as being the new kid every year in a new school. But I think I always had a good sense of humor, fighting for attention with my brothers and sisters, and but always moving around. Always felt, probably like a lot of kids, I guess, pretty insecure and just not really connected. That's what I like. If I had to define what I was as a young person, was like disconnected. There were no roots. I hear people talk about growing up in a town and a city or something like that in the same place for all those years, and my brain can't even process what that would be like. Although when I got older and had kids of my own, I made sure that my son was able to plant some roots and made sure we didn't move him around a lot. I think, when you got to make friends quickly and kind of try to fit in quickly was part of it. And I'll tell you another thing, that when I was young that I absolutely hated. My mother was really into her religion, and we had to go to church 3 times a week. And on Thursday nights, they had what they call the ministry school. And starting from a very early age, you would have to get up on the stage in front of 50 or 60, parishioners and do a 5-minute talk or a 20-minute talk or something like that. And man, I hated it because I'd be so nervous and I didn't want to talk about the Bible anyway and all that kind of stuff. But I look back now and I think that experience really got me comfortable with being in front of a crowd. I've never understood as an adult people who don't like to do public speaking. They find it, stressful or whatever. But I think between the moving around and the personality of being the youngest of 5 kids, having to always fit in, make friends quickly, and learning to get up and speak in front of a crowd from as early as about 10 years old, I think all those things, kind of layered one upon the other. And, next thing I knew, I was a grown up and I was very confident in front of a big group of people and could make friends pretty quickly. And it all kind of worked out in the end.
It's amazing what forms us. We can't go back, but we look back and we say, you know what? If I hadn't done this and that and this and that and this, I wouldn't be here. These little things do form us for better or for worse. That's why I tell people, your children, okay, you need to be careful with them. You need to make sure that you expose them to the right things and not other things, because those formative years are so critical. Don't you agree, Weldon?
Yeah, and you never know how it's gonna turn out. I saw a meme recently, and I've heard this story before. There's 2 brothers. One's an alcoholic, broke, homeless, really struggling, and his brother is very successful, very driven, very, very successful. And they asked the brother that was the Skid Row guy, like, why'd you end up like this? He said, because my dad was an alcoholic. And they asked the brother, why'd you end up like this? And he said, because my dad was an alcoholic. So we just never know how things are going to impact us and how people are going to respond, but definitely those experiences are going to kind of craft the human being that we end up being one way or the other.
Yeah. Weldon, who was your biggest influence growing up?
I would say my biggest influence growing up was one of my brothers. My older brother was 5 years my senior. My dad was gone a lot because of the military. He was in the Coast Guard, so he was out at sea a lot. And it was my older brother that kind of took me under his wing, taught me how to work on cars and how to hunt and ride motorcycles and all that kind of stuff. So I would say in my early years, definitely he was the most impactful, influential.
And if you didn't have an older brother, where do you think you would be now as far as having matured through life? Because it seems like he was almost a surrogate father.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, he certainly was. And yeah, I think that, I went through some really bad years in my early 20s and my 30s, but it's kind of interesting because looking back on it now, all these decades later, like I had the foundation, right? My brother taught me the foundation, and my mother to a large degree. The foundation was there. So after I went off the rails for about 20 years, when I got serious about my life in my 30s, I had a good example and a good foundation to get back to. And at the end of the day, I think that's partially what saved me. If I hadn't had that grounding, that experience with my mother and my brother, I really would have been more of a lost soul than I was. It could have been much worse, as bad as it was.
So you say off the rails. What happened?
Well, as I grew up and got in my teen years, still very insecure, disconnected, never really fitting in. My mom's religion really promoted the idea that, You don't trust worldly people. I put that in air quotes. You only trusted people in the church. So I had kind of a connection problem with people that if they weren't in the church, my father being gone, kind of emotionally disconnected, and just my insecurities. Dropped out of high school in ninth grade, started running the streets. And when I was 23 years old, my early 20s, I moved from South Louisiana where I grew up, and I came to Colorado in 1987. And when I was 23 years old, was high on cocaine and drunk one night, and with another guy that I picked up hitchhiking, we held a guy at gunpoint, robbed him, very quickly apprehended, not much of a plan, and was sentenced to the state penitentiary here in Colorado for 10 years. That was in 1987. Went down to the state penitentiary for about 4.5 years, and they paroled me at 27 years old. So I walk out of the penitentiary, still a ninth grade high school dropout, still a punk and a knucklehead, and no skills, no trade, no education. Now I'm a convicted felon to boot, and I began the process, which turned out to be very, very destructive, of defining myself now as this loser convict, right? That's who I was. And so I made it about 18 months, went back to prison a second time for 2 years on parole violations and gun charges, got out again at 30 years old. Now I'm a 2-time convicted felon, no experience, no education, no skills, no trade, no nothing. And I fell into a group of guys doing some shady telemarketing out in Las Vegas. I tell people I should have been suspicious when they hired me because it doesn't say much about their hiring standards.
Oh my gosh.
And did that for about 2 years. And then at 39 years old, after serving that last 7 years, so I did 13 years total in 3 different sections, but I had the shift in the mindset that really changed everything in my life. I walked out of the prison system in January of 2003 at 39 years old, got a job in the HVAC industry as a salesman. A year later, built my own company, did that for a number of years, sold those, built other companies, started writing books, and started using my story as kind of the backdrop. It's really my message to business owners, entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, individuals, personal, professional, whatever. Success in life is really about thriving in the face of adversity, overcoming challenges, in my case, all of which were self-made. But whether they're self-made or they're imposed upon us by some other institution or situation, the reality is we're going to struggle in life. There's going to be struggle. There's going to be struggle in 3 areas: money problems, relationship problems, and health problems. And the key to success in life, in my estimation, what I write and teach about, is that we have to learn to thrive in the face of that adversity. We have to prosper in the face of those difficulties, because the problems are coming, the challenges are coming. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we hit these bumps in the road. Catalyst was June 10th of 1996. I was just starting that 7 years in the federal joint. I was 32 years old, and my father died. And the reality that my dad went to his grave with me in prison again was a pretty overwhelming realization. I also had a 3-year-old son that I'd fathered out on parole. So I had this 3-year-old kid that I'd abandoned, and my father died unexpectedly at 59. So he was very young. And I remember walking out of my cell. This was within just a few hours of my dad passing away. I was devastated. And just the reality of my life hit me square between the eyes. And I walk out of my cell out into the tier in the prison cell house. I'm looking down at all the guys, slamming dominoes and cooking burritos and ramens or whatever. And I walked down to the end of the cell house, and there was a mop closet down there. And there was a box of books that was always in there that the cops would come in and just throw books in these boxes, right? It's kind of a library in that housing unit. So I start rifling through that, and I come across a copy of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which was really the first book that really, really got me on the path. And I went back to my cell and I read that book. And I remember the introduction of that chapter. And by the way, Dr. Covey became a very close friend many years later, actually endorsed my first 2 books. His son, who wrote The Speed of Trust, wrote the foreword on my 3rd book. So I've had a great experience. That family's been a very generous family to me. In the introduction of The 7 Habits, Dr. Covey talks about you have the opportunity, the ability to live out of your imagination rather than your past. And that was a life preserver, because I had gotten to the point, I was 32 years old at this point in the story, and I had kind of started to buy in. This is kind of what it's going to be: violence and prison, poverty and struggle. And all of a sudden I got this guy in his book telling me I could live out of my imagination. I had a very vivid imagination. As I began to study how the mind works, how the subconscious conditioning works, and began to study, I spent the next 7 years studying. I got a GED, I got a bachelor's degree, I got a master's degree in business management, and started reading history and philosophy, and just studying and learning all the stuff I should have learned when I was a kid, but just never got around to doing for one reason or another. But walked out of the penitentiary 7 years later, and I was a man on fire, man. It's been 20 years now, and I guess I'm slowing down a little bit now, but really not a lot. But I'm not going as hard as I used to go 10, 15 years ago. I promise you that.
Well, then it sounds like you've had tremendous success since you've come out of the penitentiary. What if you hadn't been convicted? Where do you think you would be? Now, I know it's always hard to say where you would have been, but you obviously learned a lot. You read a lot while you were in there. But where do you think you would be, just being an average person living in society?
It's a really great question. I think it's important because, number one, the direct answer is I think I'd probably be a lawyer or, a businessman or something. If I had gone and finished high school, maybe gone to college like a lot of other people. But I also know that my life would not be what it is today without that struggle. That struggle was what forged me and made me so strong and able to deal with frustrations and setbacks. I mean, I see people get so upset, they get scared about the economy or they get scared about this. And I have a very, very high tolerance for risk, pushing ahead and forging it ahead, because I know eventually I'll figure it out, whatever it is. And I think that experience taught me to be able to deal with suffering without freaking out, without overreacting, and just understanding like, hey, this is just part of the process. I don't think I would have the life I have today if I hadn't gone through that. And I tell people, they think I'm crazy. I'm like, I don't regret those 13 years in prison. I have two regrets. One is that I couldn't be there when my father died. And the second is that 3-year-old little boy was living with his drug addicted mother and went through some very, very difficult experiences from the time he was 3 to the time I got out when he was 10. I got him when I got out when he was 10. And so he suffered a lot of difficult times in there. So I have an enormous amount of regret about the experiences he had to endure because he didn't have a father there. And of course, my relationship with my father was another. But in terms of the time and the struggle, the poverty, the isolation, the boredom, the loneliness, I don't regret any of it because I just think it's all grist for the mill, as Napoleon Hill would say. It's just grist for the mill. I think it's what made me stronger.
Yeah, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger.
Yep.
You obviously tell your story. It's an important story. Do you find that some people do not want to hear your story?
That's interesting you say that, because when I first started out on the speaking thing, my first book came out, a little book called The Upside of Fear, in 2009. And I had already been doing some consulting and training on the HVAC side for some of the manufacturers. So I was getting plenty of speaking experience. I was doing 2-day sales training events. I'd kind of teach my mindset and my sales process. And when the book came out, I started getting a lot of phone calls from, FedEx and Farmers Insurance and all these other big clients and different things to come in and do keynote speaking and some training. And I wonder what it was going to be like. But I will tell you, I have been so amazed over the last 20 years how accepting most people have been. I'm sure the people that didn't want to hear it, I probably never knew about. So I only know about the people that just saw through it and they realized that was part and parcel of the whole thing. But the irony is that the companies that hire me for speaking now would never hire me as an employee. They simply couldn't, right? Because of my record. But, they'll pay me ridiculous sums of money to come in and tell the exact same story that prevents them from hiring me, which is the ultimate irony in my estimation. But for the most part, it's really been good. You got your haters out there, but I'm so used to it. I had the contracting community here back in 2007. I built my first company and we were kicking ass and taking names, and they all got together and tried to get my license pulled. They got a local business reporter to do a front page story about me and HVAC, ex-con's life in the balance, and should I have a contractor's license? And the front page of our local newspaper, above the fold, is a 6-inch by 4-inch mugshot of me and my criminal record published. And they did everything in their power to. So I've had some stuff like that people, but it's just sour grapes and jealousy and resentment that drives a lot of that stuff. And I've just learned it's just water off a duck's back. It bothers my wife sometimes when she has to see me experience it, but I've been dealing with it for so long. It's just, to me, it's a reflection of the other people. It has nothing to do with who I am as a person. I think part of leadership is being able to empathize, understand, and relate to everybody from all walks of life, right? Dr. Covey used to talk about the third alternative, which was not just to tolerate, but to embrace the differences in people and to use those differences to leverage better, problem-solving skills. And I remember a time where I was getting letters from some lifers in the Nebraska State Penitentiary. For a couple of years, these guys were writing me. They'd put some classes together using my books, and I've had that experience a lot from different penitentiary systems. But they were putting classes together for lifers of how to find meaning and significance in life even if you're doing life in prison. So they kept writing, say, would you please come see us? And I finally wrote them back and I said, guys, I can't just show up at the penitentiary. I got to have an invitation. Well, a week later, I get a letter from the warden. Please come spend some time with these guys and get them off my back. And it just so happened that I was on my way to Memphis, Tennessee to speak at an event called the 5-Star event, which is an annual event that FedEx does in Memphis at their world headquarters, where they bring in their top 200 producers across the country, top 200 executive salespeople, just the top 200 top performers. So I worked it out where I would go to Nebraska first. I spent a day with the lifers. It was an extraordinary visit. And the next day I'm speaking to the top 200 performers at FedEx. And the message was the same exact message. Right? Get focused on what you want, get emotionally committed to it, take consistent action, accept responsibility, the same process that I teach in The Power of Consistency. But I think the ability to relate and connect, and that's because of life experience, to connect at that particular event that night, I had dinner with the CEO of FedEx, and so it's like the lifers one day, the CEO at FedEx the next, and can relate to both. And I think that is a hallmark of great leadership, that you have to be able to relate and you have to treat everybody the same, right? Whether they're the CEO or they're a lifer in prison, whether they're the owner of the restaurant or the bus boy, the bus girl, you have to respect the human condition, the human nature, the human spirit. And I think great leaders do that. I think great leaders tend to be transparent and authentic, and they treat everyone the same, and they can relate through their life experiences with people at all different, places in life.
Weldon, as you know, because you went through this, an ex-con can't get a job easily.
Yeah, tough.
There are a handful, I don't know what the numbers are, you probably do, of people who spent time in prison who have come out to now have to work and will start a business as a handyman, as a plumber, as a roofer. What would you tell these individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an important public policy issue, because obviously we don't, 90% of the people in prison are getting out. They're going to be your neighbor somewhere. So we got to decide, what are we going to do with these people? So I can understand both sides of the issue. On one hand, an employer has the responsibility to protect its employees and its customers, right, and not expose them to dangerous people. On the other hand, if we can't give gainful employment to people that come out of prison, they're destined to repeat offend. It's just going to be a matter of time. I find that so much significance, especially for men, we get so much of our significance from our work. So it's a it's a real challenge that the country is going to have to face at some point. But what I tell people that are in the penitentiary is you have to be practical. I knew with my record, when I started working on my MBA and stuff and reading all these, great books and from these great leaders and writing articles and doing business, evaluations and things, it was a lot of fun. But I knew I was never going to be at IBM or FedEx, in an executive position. That was never going to happen. So I knew instinctively that the path for me was going to be small business. Now, not initially my own business. That wasn't really the plan, but the plan was to find a job in sales. And I knew it'd have to be small business, mom and pop type stuff. Somebody who would look beyond, which is exactly what happened, by the way. Somebody who would look beyond, the human resource policy of, no convicts, and that's what I tell them. You got to figure out what you're good at. I always encourage them to look at sales, because a lot of convicts have very good communication skills, borderline larceny skills. Sometimes you got to kind of moderate and ameliorate, but to look for opportunities in small business. People that don't have these strict policies that people in New York or Wall Street are writing, and you're never going to get past the background check. You got to look for places that the decisions are made right there at the mom and pop ownership level. And if they believe in you, will give you a chance, then you can have a chance. But you can still do whatever you want to do. I mean, that you can fulfill that professional passion in a million different ways. Just we have to do it a little different context. And as you mentioned, a lot of guys end up opening their own business because they simply can't find the work. And that's a problem too, because oftentimes they get into it too soon, too quickly, undercapitalized, undereducated, and it just creates a lot of financial problems for them. But definitely I tell people to look in the world of small business where you can talk to the decision maker, not some human resource manager 2,000 miles away making the decision about your life.
I find it interesting that most corporations and companies have a policy of not hiring an ex-con, but they can open up a business, and that ex-con who isn't good enough to work in an office somewhere can be in the homeowner's house.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it comes back to the responsibility of a company, that they have a responsibility to protect their employees and their customers. And so I can see where businesses wouldn't want to take that risk. I can certainly understand that. I personally have taken that risk with guys, depending on the nature of the offense. And I always tell them, I have higher expectations for you than I do for the average person. And I tell them, as my son's great grandmother used to say, you can't even tie your shoes on a watermelon patch. In other words, don't even give the appearance of stealing something or doing something wrong. And so I think that if a guy's serious about getting his act together and building a successful, productive life, like, you got to go into it with some humility and understand that we made some mistakes, and those are going to be our crosses to bear forever. But there's plenty of avenues and opportunities to fulfill your professional desires, just not maybe the traditional kind of way to go.
Weldon, if you could go back in time, what would you tell your 20-year-old self?
I would tell my 20-year-old self, as Emerson famously said, we become what we think about all day long. What I now say, it's really important. You got to think about what you think about before you think about it, because those habitual thoughts are going to create your destiny, one thought at a time. Neuroscientists estimate that we make 30,000 individual decisions every single day. And every time you make one of those choices, one of those decisions, you're metaphorically reaching in your brain and pulling out a piece of your life, whether it's a decision about money or relationships or work or sales. And if I had known that at an earlier age, that these thoughts of cutting corners and the get rich quick schemes and all that stuff, that was going to lead to a lot of dysfunctional, destructive behaviors, I would have had a different conversation with myself. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't change my life at this point. I mean, I've got a few regrets, as I told you about my dad and my son, but for me, that was a journey I had to follow. Yeah, the paradigm shift, and I'm sure there were many before Dr. Covey, he kind of popularized the whole concept of a paradigm shift. And, he talked about if you're looking at a map of Chicago, but you're in San Francisco, no matter how positive your attitude, no matter how bad you want it, you're not going to get where you want to go if you're in San Francisco looking at a map of Chicago. You're just going to get lost more quickly. And the key is to look through our lens, our paradigm, through an objective lens, right? Which is like self-awareness. Be aware of who you are, be humble, be open to criticisms, right? I remember there's a book written by a guy named Dr. Stamenow, I think his name, Stanton Stamenow, wrote a book 40 years ago called Inside the Criminal Mind. And when I was first in prison in my early 20s, I don't even know how I got the book, but I found it and I read the first few pages and I threw it across the room like, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He has no idea what my life is really like. About 15 years later, I came across that book a second time and I read my story. I read me. And I was really just blown away by, man, I remember thinking like, this isn't me, this guy's. And then I realized he was talking about me, the manipulation, the narcissism, the focus on oneself, and to think you're always the center of attention. And you come to realize nobody, it's like I try to tell my daughter's 19 and she's, the social media, they're always concerned about what pictures they post and oh, dad, that embarrassed me or whatever. And like, nobody really gives a shit. Everybody's so absorbed in their own stuff. They just don't care. But the criminal mind is one that's very narcissistic, very selfish, very self-indulgent, no humility, basic borderline paranoid. And when I came to terms with all that shit, like, oh, that's who I am. And I read that book, right? They say knowledge is power, right? And so as I came to learn those things about myself and what I had become, I was able to start working on changing it.
You obviously love to absorb books and that knowledge. What book influenced you the most?
I always say the 7 Habits, but maybe that's because it was the first. I think the one that influenced me the most is a book called Man's Search for Meaning, written by Viktor Frankl. And for those who aren't familiar with Frankl, he was a Jewish psychiatrist who was in the concentration camps in World War II and was subject to torture and human experiments and all kind of stuff. And he began to kind of be beleaguered by the question, why could some people like him, despite the torture, despite the freezing temperatures, the starvation, all the indignities they suffered, why is it he could kind of get through each day and know that one day it would be over, and others in that situation couldn't deal with it, would commit suicide? And the way they would commit suicide is they would go to the fence and put their hand on the fence, and they knew if they put their hand on the fence, the guards were going to shoot them. And that's how they would check out. He became really interested in this question, what's the difference? And he basically distilled it down to a very simple concept. For those people who can find meaning and significance in the suffering, they can get through it. But for people that see suffering from a victim perspective, why me? Why is this happening? It serves no purpose. It's just so painful. Then those people really struggle emotionally. And I remember reading that because I was in prison. I'm like, holy crap. But my life is going to have significance. I'm going to take this story and I'm going to use it to help other people overcome adversity. Of course, I got to have the happy ending first. I had to get out, build a business, and build a productive life. Sometimes I see guys getting too anxious to do that. They want to get out of jail or fix whatever and write a book the next week. You got to give it some time and let it percolate a little bit and get some track record, get some credibility. But when I realized in prison that my life would have significance, I became convinced. I didn't know exactly how or what, but there was meaning to my life. I would tell you that the first 6.5 years I was in prison were miserable because I was fighting, I was resistant, I was angry. After I had this experience with my father dying and started reading books like Viktor Frankl, it was 7 very peaceful years. Like I said, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to learn. I'm going to study. I'm going to take advantage of every day I have in here. And one of these days, I'm going to hear the gravel crunching under my feet again when they open that gate. And I'm going to build a different life because my life is going to have significance and meaning. And I just think for people that are struggling, whether it's struggling in their business, they went through a bankruptcy, why me? Or they went through a divorce, or they went through a foreclosure on their home. If you can get to a point that, number one, you realize that you probably played some role in that awful thing someone else is doing to you, at least in your mind, and you can come to know in your heart that there will be some benefit, as Napoleon Hill said, a seed of equivalent benefit. There will be some lesson. There will be some purpose. There will be some significance and meaning to this struggle. That's when you can rise up. That's when you can step up and say, okay, let me look for the opportunities now instead of looking for the blame and the misery and the complaining and the bitching and the moaning. So I think that book probably was the most impactful because I realized my life could still be about something more than it had been in the past.
Weldon, without your positive attitude, you could be back in the penitentiary. I mean, obviously you decided to make things different in your life. You and I are close in age. I've gone through things in life, not to the extreme you have, don't get me wrong, but certain times in my life, certain seasons, and your story today resonates. It's something that I totally understand. And I really understand that no one cares about you. You might think you're the most important person and have the nicest car and the prettiest girl and the biggest house. No one cares for more than 3 minutes, and then they move on. People care about who?
Themselves.
And as salespeople, that's what you really need to know. No one cares about your story. They want to know what you can do for them. So you've really taken it to a great level. I'm sure when you speak in front of groups, a lot of people go, okay, that's why my wife left me, right? I mean, seriously.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I've been through a divorce when I was young, and I didn't think it was my fault at all. It's all her fault, right? It was the best experience of my life, though.
I would tell you this, that probably one of the most empowering moments of my life was when I realized and could see my role in every bad thing I thought people had ever done to me. When I could see how I played a role in that. And that is the end of victimhood. That is the beginning of personal responsibility. And it also is the beginning of opening up every opportunity that you want in life. Because as long as the problem is out there, right, then for everything to work out for you, everybody else has to do the right thing for you, right? If they're really the problem. What's the likelihood of that happening? It's not going to happen, right? But if the problem's inside, if it's an inside job, if it is to be, it's up to me. And I can change my thinking. That was one of the things that Viktor Frankl said. When you can no longer control the circumstances around you, you have only but one choice, and that's to control the one thing you control, which are your thoughts and your behaviors. And the more you focus on that, the better things get. But yeah, seeing my role in the ex-wives and the divorces and the obviously the criminal incarceration and things, and understanding why it was happening and that I did it, right? It didn't happen to me. I did it. That's a big, I think, a moment of growth for all of us to see how we played a role in these, so-called, negative events or whatever.
When I look back at my life, I really realized that I probably didn't become a mature man until my 40s.
Yeah.
And I got married young, divorced, then still married relatively young again. But when I look back now in my 50s, I'm like, I was an okay guy, but I was not the man I am today. It's really fun though, because I tell young people who are struggling with certain things, I say, just give it time, buddy. You're on a good path, because I've been there and you're doing fine. And you're going to really like yourself in your 40s and 50s. And they're like, what are you talking about? That's old. I said, you'll enjoy it. Trust me.
It's funny. I always tell people that I'm all about transformational growth, because life is short and it takes 40 years to figure out what the hell is going on with relationships, with money, with just everything, your health. And by the time you figure it out, your life's half over. So, who's got time for baby steps, right? Slow and steady doesn't always win the race. Slow and steady oftentimes gets your ass beat. So I'm about transformational growth, getting out there, getting things done, shaking the money tree, doing what you got to do to grow your business, invest in your relationships, invest in yourself and your mental and your physical health and spiritual health and those things. Because life is tragically short.
Oh, it is. Especially as we get older, right? We're around the same age, and we kind of can see the finish line now. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but when you're like 12 years old, like old people, so I thought my grandparents were a different species, right? They're just old people. I didn't know that was something I might grow into when I get older. And if I'm lucky enough, apparently I will. Everyone's good at something. Like there's usually one thing they're really good at. Weldon, what is your superpower?
I would say the thing that brings me the most success, and I've had my IQ tested 3 times. It's 103. And so I'm not the smartest tool in the shed, none of that stuff. To me, it's the ability to focus on the right things and not get distracted with other things, right? Like, what's the thing we have to do today, right? And the ability to focus, right? James Allen said that dispersion is weakness and concentration is power. And I, somewhere along the way, got the ability to concentrate and focus on whether it's writing a book or a seminar or building a business, and not just to stay focused, but to stay focused on the right things. People get distracted with so much bullshit, right? People will open a business and they will spend, weeks picking out the perfect desk and the perfect lamp. You know what? If you want to open a business, get a freaking customer, set a lead, right? Focus on the right things, the things that have to be done right in front of you. And knowing when to take action on certain things, I think has really been a help to me.
Interesting you brought that up about, the desk, the lamp, the office space or whatever. I've met so many people who get into a business because they like to do certain things. Like, I want to open up a coffee shop.
Right.
Well, I'm like, okay, so what's the business plan? I'll serve coffee and donuts. No. How are you going to make money? I'll just have all my friends and neighbors come over, and so we've all seen this before, right? And that's really not the best way to do it. You've got to really start with the business plan in mind. And I've started a number of businesses without a plan on paper, but I had one in my mind. And it's very simple. How much am I going to charge? What's it going to cost roughly? And then what am I going to have left over? If that leftover is a negative number, maybe I should put it on paper. And if it still says negative, maybe I should leave the coffee shop behind.
Exactly. And where am I going to find those customers? Right. IBM founder Thomas Watson Sr. said nothing happens till something gets sold, which is true, but it's also true. Nothing gets sold till somebody sets a damn lead. And so people fail to look at the lead generation side. They look at the sales function as to be despised. In the contracting world, it's crazy, because I'll ask these contractors, if it's the busiest day in the summer, you got 100 service calls stacked up, would you ever go in and ask your accountant to run service calls? Of course not. But when it comes to sales, you'll find anybody with a pulse and their breathing and the heartbeat, and that's my sales guy. You go out and do sales. No training, maybe not even a good fit, but we have to elevate the sales and the marketing function to be just as important as the technology and the service and the operational side of the business.
Yeah, and sometimes we make a mistake of taking our best sales guy and making him or her a manager.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. Is that person the best person for that? It may be someone who's not even in your organization, who wasn't the best salesperson, but maybe they're better with people and understand sales in general.
Amen. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Hey, this has been great, Weldon.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks for having me. I will tell you that I am getting to that age where the big objective down the road is less is more. Our kids are gone. My son's 30. My stepdaughter's 20. She's in college out in South Carolina. My wife and I ramble around this big old house. I don't have to travel like I used to. So I see a lot of RVing in my future. I love to ride dirt bikes and off-road jeeping and dune buggies. We have all that stuff. And we got this big RV bus. And the next 3 to 5 years, as we wrap up some of these projects that we're working on, my focus is going to be on my wife and my kids and just spending as much time with them as I can.
Hear, hear. You won't get an argument from me.
Yeah.
Weldon, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Entrepreneurship, got that inspiration. Yeah, now I'm just doing it. Working on these projects, my ideas I'm pursuing. No matter what the problem, the solution, I'm proving it. Let's talk about it and open up the dialogue. Contractors telling their stories about how they got it started and how they keep it going. The passion fuels the mission. Now we blasted into orbit, we gone. That's where we grow from. Started with the vision, make the pitch and knock it out the park like home runs. We keep it moving, self-belief, no doubt. Pass off the mic to my man's Jim Klauck. Hey, I don't wanna stop for nothing. I just wanna keep it going. Telling these authentic stories. You better believe, you better believe. I don't wanna stop for nothing. I just wanna keep it going.